For tonight, I'm going to start us off with a little bit of from the Bible here. Starting in Mark 15, verse 24. And they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was the third hour when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which I'm probably butchering, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing near heard this, they said, "Listen, he's calling Elijah." One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down," he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. I'm going to stop there. See, the thing is that there's a lot more fleshed out in different Gospels. The Gospel of John talks about Jesus saying more than that, saying it's finished before he dies. But the reason why we're looking at this particular collection of verses is because it highlights one of the thing that we're talking about tonight, and especially highlights the way that it was something that Jesus himself had to go through. And the fun thing that we're going to start off with talking about for the new year is abandonment. Now, the thing about abandonment is that, to abandon something in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. We can use the term abandon in a lot of different ways. It basically just means to leave behind. The problem is that when we talk about abandonment, oftentimes what we're talking about is that point when we're left feeling, or very much so being, left without friends, family, loved ones, basically the people in our lives that are supposed to take care of us, watch over us, be there for us, or whatever else, decide that they're not going to. And as a result of that, you're left sitting there by yourself. And one of the kind of cold hard realities that Christians have to face is that feeling doesn't necessarily, that's not something that's exclusive to people. That's very much a feeling that's inclusive to God. And the reason why we read this particular chapter and verse is because it's the point where Jesus got to feel abandoned by God for the first time that he walked on the earth. See, the truth of it is that, for clarity's sake, when we talk about the way that Jesus was abandoned by God, or left to feel that way especially, it ends up being a little different from some of the things that we can experience. Because essentially what we have is that, God separated himself from himself. It's almost like he took a part of himself and dropped it by the wayside. And I suppose in retrospect, some of us maybe have felt that way at times, like a piece of us has fallen away and ended up being left somewhere. But the thing of it is that when we talk about abandonment, most of us don't have that experience with God. Most of us have never had God literally turn his back on us. We've felt that way, for sure. I don't think there's a single person that believes in God that can honestly say they've never felt abandoned by him. And the key word here is honest, because not everybody is honest about that. And it's ironic, too, because God doesn't call us into fake relationships. He calls us into honest ones. The Psalms is littered with David and other people speaking out their despair, feeling abandoned by God. My God, why have you forsaken me?" is not something that's solitarily Jesus' domain. This is something that you'll hear throughout the scriptures. David himself, "How long will you hide your eyes from me? How long will you leave me, or will you abandon me to my enemies?" The truth of the matter is that we go through storms in life many times over. And what we feel in the midst of them is that we're alone. Job didn't feel close to God when he was going through everything that happened with him. He didn't feel like God had his back. In fact, felt something very, very much the opposite. And that's not unique. And it's something that we kind of have to struggle with as followers of Jesus. Those times when we cry out to God asking him to do something to help us in some way, and he doesn't answer. At least he doesn't answer in a way that we want him to, or is immediately placating in any way, shape, or form. So, what do we do with that feeling? Well, the first thing that I want us to do is to look at that feeling and what that is. Because it's important to do that. See, too many times what we do as followers of Jesus, what we do as people in general, it doesn't even matter if you believe in God. People who feel abandoned by other people, what they do oftentimes is they'll harden themselves. They say, "Oh, nobody's got my back, I'm just going to do it all myself. That's fine. I've got this." I can't tell you how many times I've done that in the past. You develop that little chip on your shoulder and that hard-nosed attitude that says, I've got this. It's fine. I'll be strong if nobody else will hold me up. Screw you. And it doesn't really go anywhere. I mean, you might accomplish some things, a lot of things even sometimes, but then again, you always find yourself at the disposal of other people's choices. Because the truth of the matter is that we all have to face and acknowledge and be real about as human beings is that we're not actually little islands in and of ourselves. We don't get to be. As much as we'd like to pretend we are, feel like we are, think we are, and act like we are, we're just as much connected to each other as we are to God, as we are to the world, as we are to every other thing. Okay? Every action you take will affect somebody or something. And if that action is destructive, you'll be culpable for that. It will be your responsibility whether you want it to be or not. Just as much as if you lift something up, you'll be culpable for that as well. And those blessings fall on us anyways. So, as a result of that, the thing about feeling abandoned or being abandoned is that's when everyone else takes that kind of mindset and you become the victim of it. You become the person who's being ditched, who's being left behind, who's being abandoned, who's being hurt. And that's unfortunately a normal thing that happens. Like, we've all been there in some way, shape, or form. You know, maybe it's your parents, maybe it's your friends, maybe it's some spouse, some loved one. People have it happen from their children. Maybe it's your church. Or maybe it's all the above, and you've just kind of had that particular kind of life where you've gotten to become very, very comfortable with the feeling of being abandoned. Or you've buried it and are trying to run from it as hard as you can. So the first thing that we have to acknowledge is that it's there, right? Look at it, feel it. And especially to see where it came from. So like I gave a little list right there of individuals who can cause us to feel abandoned. So I'm going to give it a minute for you guys to think about it. Just think about who it is in your life who has left you who has left you to feel abandoned at one point or another. Maybe it's just one person that comes immediately to mind. Maybe it's God himself. Maybe it's a ton of people or a ton of things or churches or work.
Do you want us to share?
Nope.
Okay.
No, I don't.
I got a long list, so you don't want to hear it.
Okay.
So the thing of it is that, you know, once you've got those people or that person or whatever, you know, how's that feel? See, the thing about abandonment, the thing that's tricky about it, is that abandonment in and of itself is not actually a thing. And what I mean by that is the feeling of being left alone, of being left behind, isn't really a danger in and of itself, it's what comes with it. See, it's not like anger or despair, where it can be an individual quantity in your emotional real estate. Abandonment is much worse because it comes with a collection of things. If you feel abandoned, it comes with feelings of being unwanted, uncared about, unseen, not good enough.
Unsafe because you're not, you don't have that community, that backup plan.
Mm-hmm.
And your pack is kind of shunning you. You have no pack.
Exactly. There are all kinds of things that come with it. And it's never alone. It's kind of like that little gang of thugs that pulls you into a back alley and pummels you for a little while. It's not like any of the other ones. I mean, depression effectively feels like somebody just walks up and stabs you in the chest. No, this is a gang, and it might be one of them. See, the thing of it is that it's something where it preys on our insecurities in every way, shape, or form, because the truth is that we all have them. We all go into the environment around us that is our community or our collection of different communities, aware that we're not perfect. See, the truth is that a lot of us try to compensate for our imperfections, for the things that we're worried that other people will see, by trying to change them or trying to make ourselves look better. And as a result, you know, we tend to spend a lot of time focused on that. And as we focus on that, we tend to lose sight of what might be seen in the process there. So when we're dealing with that, when we're sitting with that,
There you go.
I think he's wondering where the bathroom was.
yeah. Anyway, you know, when we're sitting with that, and behind the train of thought. It's temporarily gone.
I apologize.
It's all good.
You had to pee.
Yeah. Right.
All I heard was sitting in a temporary train. So confused.
Okay. So, when we're kind of hit with all those different things and left to kind of struggle with them, right, the insecurities, the things that we're always trying to kind of hide. See, we're so focused on trying to be the best interpretation of ourselves as far as we can see it, that, you know, we try to mask those insecurities, we try to mask those imperfections so nobody's going to see them. You know, if I'm actually really insecure in my manhood, I'm not going to show everybody that. Instead, I'm going to try to put my best foot forward and try to look whatever look is going to match what people think I should be the best. And see, it's kind of an innate problem because we're not being honest with who we are. We don't present ourselves in a genuine way. Instead, what we do is we present a semblance of ourselves. Well, as a result of that, that makes us very, very vulnerable to those insecurities. And when those insecurities get brought up, they are just allowed to run wild all over us. See, none of us are really as good as we like to portray ourselves. Not honestly. Like, we all have flaws and limitations, and we grow. Like, as we develop in our relationships with God, we definitely grow and develop and become closer and different, and we change with time. But we still have but we still have our own innate little flaws, pitfalls, different things that we can easily trip on. There was a word that God gave to Heather that was about the way that when oftentimes when something is fixed, it's still weak in that spot that it was broken. And oftentimes that's all it takes, is just that little bit of added pressure in that particular point. Even though it's been healed over, it might break again more easily. We become more susceptible to things. So if we have a history of being abandoned by our family members, for example, it becomes like an in for them to be able to just punch through again and again and again. And by them, I mean that your family has the ability to break through that strength and do that damage again and again and again. It's kind of like, you know, you might go out into the world away from them and be able to be strong and healthy in this particular part, but somehow when you go for family dinner or whatever, they're able to just take that shot and pierce that thing, and then suddenly you're just all broken inside again. And you're just left to feel everything that comes with that feeling of abandonment, and that just spirals. So, and where the insecurities come in, oftentimes it's giving breath to that. Your abandonment takes advantage of your insecurities, elevates them, escalates them, balloons them up to make you believe so many different things. You know, and this comes right off the back of talking about the kind of self-critic that a lot of us have. And I always reference back to the spiritual warfare series because it was important. And because we talked about the way that demons utilize these things so skillfully to break us down. So whether it's the people themselves, you, or a spiritual adversary, somebody's trying to hurt you. And they're going to use this circumstance to do it. And the crappy thing about it is the harder we try to pretend it's not there, the harder we try to be strong about it, the better they're going to succeed. So we end up having to give time for this to really be changed. So, going back to the point about feeling this, recognizing it. It's really important that we kind of struggle with these emotions and what they feel like, and even just the realities of it. You had a couple friends hurt you. They abandoned you in a time when you needed help, and maybe they were even the cause of that abandonment. Maybe they went as far as to utterly betray you. And now you're left with that, the wreckage of it. Well, at the end of the day, feeling your way through that's going to be hard. Because one, you have to deal with all the things that are there, but the other part, the really important part about abandonment here, is to acknowledge who is at fault. And this ends up being extremely important because, like I said earlier, whenever we're on the receiving end of this abandonment, we're the victims. Oftentimes, we're the ones who are being rejected. We're the ones that have other people using their free will to hurt us.
Right.
And it's important to remember that and where the responsibility lays. Because one thing that people have a bad tendency to do is to take responsibility on themselves for people who aren't willing to take responsibility for themselves. So what I mean is, a constant thing you'll see with children who are abused is they take responsibility on their own shoulders to say, it was my fault that my parents were this way to me. I deserved this because I wasn't a good child. I wasn't this, I wasn't that. And they justify it for them. Effectively, what they do is they change the dynamic so it's their fault. They earned the abuse, they earned the suffering, they earned whatever was done to them in order to absolve their parents so that they can keep going back to them as parents. It's kind of a weird psychological quirk that happens all the time. But it's important for us to remember that that's not true. Concerning the levels of things that we've gone through from people, that's never been our fault. See, when you needed help with your with your relationship and your friends not only abandoned you, but actually even schemed around it to betray you in the process, that was not because of anything that you did, that was all on them. When your family abandoned you again and again and again when you needed help, that wasn't on you. They made a choice over and over and over again. When you were calling out, when you were crying out, when you needed somebody to love you, they said no. And that wasn't because you weren't good enough, that was because they made choices based on their own perceptions, and that's their fault. When you were struggling in the church, and you needed help, and they left you, turned their backs on you, abandoned you, that was on them. I always remember this conversation with a woman. She was a witch. It was over the YouTube channel. And basically she was mad at me because my testimonial video she thought was going to be something else. She said that I was faking because it had Lucifer in the title, and she was just like, you just set up a trap. It was a, what's the term? False advertising, for lack of a better word. I can't remember what they
Clickbait?
call it. Clickbait. Thank you. She claimed it was clickbait. I'm just like, but I literally talk about talking with Satan and stuff like that. And she hadn't even watched the video. So she went back and watched it. And afterwards had questions, but she talked about how she had actually been a part of a church for a long time. And then she got a divorce. And the thing that happened was that everybody in the church effectively turned on her after her divorce because she had a lot of very hard questions. Very, very hard questions about God and about the church, and the pastor didn't appreciate her asking them. So rather than try to help her through this, they effectively rejected her, turned their backs on her again and again and again. She was abandoned by the people that she needed. And in the process of them abandoning her, she left the church and found a new way. A new way. Yeah.
One more time, Shane. We didn't get it the first 2 times.
So the thing that happened was that she turned her back on God as a result of the people who were representing him to her. And that happens all the time. All the time. The church in and of itself has a really nasty habit of doing this, letting judgment get in the way of mercy. It harkens back to things where God got after the church for exactly that point. When Jesus looked at the Pharisees and said, "Learn what this means to love mercy." So, talking about abandonment, again, it's important to remember like where this all goes, where responsibility lays. And yeah, like it is also important to acknowledge where, if you became a monster, it's important to recognize where you became a monster. When I think back to my personal instances within the church, there were times where I was abandoned by friends and people and family even, who were really trying to help me. And the reason why I was rejected by some of them was because I didn't see them. I was too busy, being wrapped up and messed up in my own hurt and my own abandonment and my own feelings, and projecting that onto those people to even be able to receive help from them.
Yeah.
And that's on me. Like, that's mine. I did that. I didn't appreciate the hands reaching out to help. For one reason or the other. And when I look back on it, like, yeah, some of them were fake, and that's fine. I don't feel bad about rejecting those. But I do feel bad about rejecting the ones that weren't, that were honestly trying to help. And that's the thing, like, accountability is important, and where it lays is important. So when we're feeling this out, looking at the person or people who made you feel abandoned, and acknowledging where responsibility lays for the decisions that were made, that's where we need to sit with this. Honestly, who's at fault? And the truth is that a lot of times we're not going to find it falling on our shoulders. I have one example of my own where, yeah, I did it. It was me. I have 100 more where it wasn't. And that ends up being the thing that we run into so many times over and over and over again. And it's important for us to have grace on ourselves in those particular instances. Because again, like last week, we talked about that critical spirit that so many of us have. That inner critic that just will tear us apart if we let it. And if that's a part of you, like, it'll want to. this is a fantastic avenue for self-mutilation, unless we can be honest about it, because honesty is often the greatest thing that contends with that mindset, that thing inside of us. Even when we're faced with the enemy, when demons come at us with lies, what's stronger than truth? Like, God comes bringing truth, and he'll tell it to you again and again and again.
Yeah.
So when the enemy comes telling you that lie, and even though that feels familiar, that feels right, maybe it's because you believe that from your childhood. Maybe it's because you've adopted that viewpoint because your parents made you feel that way. Your parents always made you feel weak and meaningless and hopeless and pathetic, and that you deserve nothing. So when the enemy comes up, even though God has told you that he delights in you, that he died for you, that he gave everything for you, because he saw you as valuable, he saw you as meaningful, suddenly you've got this other voice saying, well, that's not true. And you believe that other voice because that's what you're accustomed to. And the irony of this is that oftentimes, because we follow that voice, we can actually then put ourselves in places where we feel abandoned by God, because we are rejecting the truth that he's laying down for us in order to believe the lie that we've been raised to believe. And then we turn back to God saying, why aren't you here? One of the biggest things, like I've said, is that when we're facing abandonment, we're going to have to face honesty. And we're going to have to be honest about things. And sometimes that can be really hard with perspectives, especially when we've been raised with certain ones. But the truth is that when we can sit back and be objective, and oftentimes it helps to have community, to have other people to talk through things with you. You know, if I've been raised with this idea, like a poverty mindset is a very real one for myself, just to be straightforward. Believing that I can never achieve certain things because I've been raised poor. You know, suddenly I find myself talking to like Grant, for example, and he presents a very different perspective. You know, I can give my arguments, but eventually I'm gonna have to acknowledge that I'm wrong, because his arguments are stronger, and he's right. And that's kind of the beauty.
Don't stop. Keep
He's
going.
fanning himself. He even give me a
Oh, okay.
Is he sitting back there tickling his own ears right now?
A little bit.
He's going like
Having
this.
his feet up in the
It's
air,
fair
too.
though. He earned
He's
it.
going like this.
But I'm referring to a real conversation.
Yeah,
So.
yeah.
But that's the thing here, is that oftentimes we need other eyes and ears on this stuff, and that includes ourselves. Like, I don't if I'm navigating this whole kind of life and community and having to deal with my own abandonment issues, you know, I'm obviously not going to expect every person around me to understand me deeply, but I can expect that they're going to see things about me and they're going to be honest about what they see. And if they're not going to be honest about what they see, then they're not going to be part of my life for very long, are they? But that's the thing, is that I want people to be honest with me, because that's what helps me get through these particular instances. And that's going to be something for all of us. The pathway from feeling abandoned and isolated and alone is not a lonely path. It's going to be one with friends. Because that's the direct conflict to feeling abandoned, is to feel accepted, to feel loved, to feel wanted, to feel valuable. And that's always going to be a thing. That's always going to be what we need, and that's always going to be the point of any kind of community like this. And if it's not, then you're just wasting your time. At the end of the day, when God calls us into community, he calls us into it it's not about just gathering together to learn about him. Rather, in the community, is a reflection of how God himself lives. Going back to this verse and talking about Jesus and the way and the reality of what this looks like for him, when God cut himself off from himself, when we talk about God, we talk about a being that lives in constant community. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit all live as a single triune being. They are never without another part of themselves. God is one entity split into three individuals. It's weird, but God's weird because that's the way it works. And that's not to say like we can't talk about that or anything like that. We can talk about it, but it's weird.
Is it like a hive mind almost?
Kinda, yeah. Like it's a little bit more. It's a little less It's a little less specific than a hive mind, and a little bit more obscure.
Oh, that's very helpful. Thank you.
I know, right? You're welcome. We could do the glass of water thing, but it just never quite fits, because it's like there's this, if you imagine it, the best way that I can describe the Trinity is to think of three individual beings connected by one particular line of light. And they're all three connected to the same center, but they're all part of it. They represent different faces, but they're all part of the same wheel. And that's the thing that we run into with God, is like he cut off a part of that wheel. For the first time in God's existence, he was not whole. And Jesus felt the weight of that. And the thing of it is that he's probably, I won't say he's the only one, because that's just not true. See, the sneaky thing about abandonment is that it is a feeling more than a circumstance. And yeah, it's a circumstance, like don't get me wrong on that. It's just that the situation of being abandoned doesn't stick with you like the feeling of being abandoned does. That's what you carry on. That's what you remember. That's what hurts you and then sticks with you at other points when you have to trust people. And you have to worry suddenly. You have to have that moment of pause that says, oh, maybe these people aren't going to have my best interest. Maybe they're actually not going to care about me when I need to care. That's that thing that pops up and we have to face. But the feeling of it can be much more treacherous because it's not always true. You know, with a lot of people, we talk about the issue of feeling abandoned by God. And that is an entire can of worms in and of itself that we will tackle. Because the truth of the matter is that it's not simple. I can't simply say that in this situation God wasn't there. Because the truth is, most situations God has been there. And the thing of it is that we get caught up a lot on the idea, and I've actually preached this and been wrong before. We get caught up on the idea that, of the omni-God. Thomas Aquinas was the one that presented the idea of the omni-God. Omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresence. And basically it's just this idea that God's always there, he's always aware, he's always everything. But what that doesn't take into consideration is that God's own limitations that he puts on himself. What I mean by that is we talk about, for example, God's unwillingness to force a person, he's unwilling to take control of a person, to possess a person, unless they're willful. He's never going to force his will onto people in this particular way. Not like a demon where they'll possess you and make you go do things. God won't do that. If you want to make a decision, going back to our discussion about free will, if you really want to do something, you have the freedom to go do that. And you also have the freedom to enjoy the results of that and everything that comes with that. You know, God was in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve had the decision to taste of that fruit. He didn't stop them. He had told them not to. But they were allowed to make a choice with what they wanted to do. That's kind of like the double-edged sword that free will can be. But in the same token, you know, when we talked about having to give God the credit of personage, to allow him to see him as an individual, as a person, as something other than just a nondescript entity, you know, we also have to acknowledge the things that he does himself. So if you tell him, I don't want you here, and he says, okay, it's not really fair for you to get mad at him when you've told him you want nothing to do with him, and suddenly he's not coming to your aid when you cry out for help. This happens a lot. And a lot of us don't like to admit it. Like, I can think back to instances where I've told God, like, I don't want you here. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want you around me right now, where I was just angry at him, frustrated, in states of doubt or rebellion. And in those particular instances, you know, things went bad. And, you know, I took and tried to do things my own way, and they didn't work. And as a result of that, I was mad at him. I was angry at him for not helping me do the things that I wanted to do all by myself, even though I told him to leave me alone. Is that fair? Like, if I tell Stephanie that I don't want to talk to her, and I tell her to leave me alone, and then suddenly I get into a fight with, her stepdad, and is it fair for me to get mad at her for not helping me deal with that? Of course not. At no point in time would that ever be fair or even logical. But this is how we treat God so often. Like I said, honesty is one of the most important things for dealing with this particular issue with abandonment. Because there's so many times where we feel abandoned by God, but we haven't actually been abandoned by him any more than we've asked him to not be present. Then we end up in the other territory where it's not that. We are in fact asking him to be there. We are in fact begging him to be there. There's not a single part of us that has stood up and said, I don't want you. No, these are the ones where we're in storms and trials and struggles, and we're begging God to help us, and he doesn't seem to be lifting a finger. See, this is the part that isn't really easy. You know, it's easy when you can just like take the blame on yourself and say, actually, I told God to take a hike, or I wasn't listening to him, or any number of different things. The hard thing is when we find ourselves in this particular boat where we're begging him and he's not answering. And there are a lot of reasons why this happens this way, okay? And not all of them seem fair. Sometimes, you know, in the story of Job, for example, we see an instance where a lot of, like, the kind of the traditional viewpoint that a lot of preachers will speak is that, you know, Job was a righteous man and, you know, was great before God and all this other stuff. But, you know, later on in the story, like, look, if God was happy with Job, like completely content with Job, and that was the story, like he just did this to prove something, to prove that Job was faithful, then why is it that at the end God shows up as a storm cloud and questions Job brutally about Job's knowledge of things? Like, that's not conducive with the narrative that we're oftentimes presented with the story of Job, okay? Especially when we go back and read the actual story and see what Elihu says to Job, which is effectively just like, you've justified yourself before God. What are you doing? And then you compare the things that Job was mad at God for not having anymore with the things that Jesus chastises the Pharisees for loving. You see that maybe there's something there that wasn't necessarily there. And sometimes it's only in these kinds of storms that that stuff can get churned up. Sometimes we go through really hard trials. And sometimes the purpose of those trials is not to test our faith, but rather it's to have us go back and see where we're really at, to churn up this kind of all the stuff that's underneath. I can jump up and tell everybody that I'm like a fantastic Christian. I can do the Bible studies, I can do the Bible trivia, I can run ahead, I can do the groups, and I can run up onto the church pulpit and prophesy and do all these crazy things and just show the world that I'm on fire for Jesus. But that doesn't mean anything when I lose my phone and start cursing the name of God because my relationship with him is completely shallow. Everything is face level, and I actually have no legitimate faith inside of me. Again, we go back to that point about honesty and about how God calls us into honest relationships. It's not hard to fake it with this. I mean, most people treat the Bible like a list of rules anyways. If you just follow the rules, you look great. I've done it. I look fantastic. People wanted to put me in leadership at the church. It wasn't real, though. I didn't actually believe any of that, and that came through when I went through one trial after another trial. And I had to actually learn that I could have faith in God. And I had to actually learn that I could trust in him. And that didn't look pretty. That didn't look like me saying, "Oh, praise the Lord for teaching me this." No, it looked like me being very, very angry and very, very bitter and very, very sad and very, very, a lot of emotions that were very pronounced and very expressive, shall we say. As I started to see things about myself and who I actually was, as opposed to who I was telling everybody I was. The reality is we can put on the show all we want. And sometimes these trials and tribulations, these struggles, these storms that we go through are to show us that we're faking it. And to show us that there's a place for us to have a real relationship and that we're not really there right now. And that's a really hard one because that doesn't feel good. Those are the times where we can become really, really bitter with God because that feeling of abandonment can become very, 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 very pertinent, and it can actually eclipse any actual healing, any actual joy that we might see from the real things that get churned up. Again, it comes back to honesty. Then there are other times where what it really boils down to is something that's a lot less explicit, a lot less kind of brutal. He gave me an example, actually. I was sitting in the car, like I was getting ready to leave. I don't remember where I was going, but it was a couple weeks ago. And I stopped because I felt God specifically tell me to stop. And the car door was still open, and I see this woman coming with her kid on a bike right behind me. Now, daughter still has training wheels on, and daughter's not ridden a bike before, clearly. And there came a point where the mom had to let go of the bike, and the kid had to ride on her own. Well, she hit the handle on the door of the car as she was passing, and that scared her half to death. So she just started shrieking and screaming, and like she was mad at her mom for letting her go and all these other things. And I'm just sitting there, and I know, you know, as an adult, as a person seeing this, that in retrospect, she was always going to need to let that child go in order for that child to learn to ride the bike. But the daughter can't see that, because she doesn't understand how this works. She doesn't actually appreciate it. Even if she had a little manual that showed her how it all happens, step by step. Mom rides you on the bike, mom lets go of the bike, you ride forward, try not to hit anything, oops, you hit something, you know, whatever. The point is that it was important to see that at some point in time, she was gonna have to be left to her own devices for a moment to actually be able to learn how to do what she was meant to do. And that was the point that God highlighted to me, and specifically for tonight's message. Sometimes it's not about churning up the inside stuff. Sometimes it is about helping us develop in who we are. And sometimes that can be really scary, and sometimes that can be really uncomfortable, but God's not far off. That little girl felt abandoned by her mom, but it wasn't actually what her mom's intention was. Her mom was right there the whole time, chasing her down the moment that she hit that thing, to take care of her, to hold her and tell her she was going to be okay and nurse the wound. So, when we talk about abandonment, honesty is always going to be the most important thing. We have to be honest, and if we need help with that, and we always will, because the truth is that we're all raised with a lot of weird perceptions. You know, like, I talk about my own poverty mindset, for example. Like, I grew up poor. Poor is all that I know. The idea of ever having money seems diluted to me. I need help with that, because I can't see past that. Not on my own. And we all have our own little things. I've been referencing this whole fake it till you make it thing throughout the course of this message, because that's one of those things. Sometimes the only way that we see forward, a lot of Christians, the only way that they believe they can be Christians is by looking like a Christian. They think if I look like a Christian long enough, I'll become a Christian. But that's not real. The truth of the matter is that your relationship with God will never actually deepen as you keep trying to project an image, because all of your mental real estate is in projecting an image. It's not in actually letting him get deep and to change the things inside of you that need to change in order for you to actually be that Christian. You can either look like it or you can be it. There's no in between. So, with that, that's what I've got for tonight.